Yeah, so as I was listening to your presentation, I was thinking that there is a particular figure that is emerging in this corporate wellness programs, and that is the figure of the ideal employee. What kind of ideal employee is, we are dealing with? And a lot of it is about this ideology of engagement, participation, being active, being a team player, and being connected, as you mentioned before. But when you look at the reality of it, actually it is really hard to get people to engage, to get people to live up to that ideal figure of the connected, active team player employee. And it's also led me to a question, well, to what extent, these schemes are voluntary and cast in a way that is really about choice rather than about control, and how much of it is really imposed? Because if companies are realizing they're investing in the schemes, but then employees are not really responding in the way they anticipated. So do you see maybe the future of the schemes becoming more of an imposition, an imperative rather than a choice, like slipping from the internalized norms towards back again the authoritarian kind of impulse of control? And this is a question for the three of you.
I'll go briefly. I think for me the ideal employee is something along those lines, as you said, the kind of connected, active team player, this kind of thing. But there's this notion in management, well, it comes from psychology, I think, of flow. The notion of flow, and I've got a definition of it somewhere, but it's something along the lines of being in this absolute state of total engagement and kind of self-forgetfulness, sort of like being in the zone as a sports player. And I think that is again kind of the ideal that gets talked about, and these are seen as ways of enabling that. But I think they do remain on the level of ideals, and no one really expects them to be in a sense implemented. But it's kind of like a utopian thing. It's always kind of in the distance. But all those things are kind of connected with that. And for me, in terms of this, as I mentioned about seeing it in terms of what Bernard Stiegler talks about as programming, as a kind of programming through psychopolitics, all of these kinds of systems are engaged on that level of psychopolitics, of kind of reprogramming or programming our consciousness in various ways to think in terms of that. So those ideals might not be achievable in reality, but they're kind of there as something to compare ourselves against. All of in terms of being voluntary, all of the ones, all the organisations, it was about 10 organisations I spoke to, it was all voluntary in there. And I've not heard about it being imposed in the UK. I think it's either imposed or almost imposed, and maybe in some cases in the United States, I think. BP and some others. Insurance reasons, yeah, exactly, for insurance reasons. So I think whether it's going to be imposed on it is probably going to be contextual, depending on those particular situations. I couldn't, in the cases I was looking at, I couldn't see it being imposed, purely for the kind of the reasons I outlined, that they weren't really that interested. In the cases I was looking at, which is really interesting contrast with what Phoebe and Lukasz were talking about, is that they weren't really even interested in the data. I thought, this would be great. They're going to be really data hungry and seeing what they can do. They weren't really interested. It was almost a marketing exercise, an internal marketing exercise. That's right. Yeah. The employer brand kind of idea. They didn't actually do anything with the data. The only way that they used the data, you tended to get some data back from these companies like Virgin and GCC, and then presented it to their sort of board or their management to say, oh, look, this is how great it is. You should fund it for next year. But they admitted that it was just, they didn't really get what it meant. They didn't really interested. It was just a way of justifying spending on the project.
So when you say marketing strategy, is it a marketing for the employer or for the self-tracking industries?
Just really briefly. Just the employer to the employees. Yeah.
Oh, actually, what's really interesting, we didn't actually explain how the company set out to carry this project. One thing is to say it's a multinational corporation, and they basically they work with clients to find really big spaces. So Coca-Cola, for example, IBM work with this company to find the right kinds of spaces to set up wherever they've decided to kind of set up shop. But another feature, and the smaller medium enterprise that we worked that was integrated into the bigger company, was also worked in human resource activities and workplace design initiatives themselves. So it's quite interesting kind of paradox there, in the sense that this company, as they joined the bigger company, which I won't name, but you can easily find it because we've actually we've put up a report for the company on their website. So they've not told us to be anonymous, but we thought we would just leave it out of the paper. But anyway, they decided that in joining the bigger company, they would use this quantified workplace experiment as a way of saying, this is what we have to offer you. We're on the cutting edge. We have these new interesting workplace designs to offer you, the bigger real estate company. But so what they said in running the project is that they were developing a product, which is very interesting. So when we came in as the independent social scientist and behavioral psychologist, is we made it very clear, okay, so what we'd like to do is the observational methodology, that we're looking at what you're working on, we're going to report on it, as it were. Everything was agreed, absolutely fine. And I think that adds another interesting dimension to the employment relationship that I didn't mention particularly here, but it's about opting in and opting out. There's recent research in the legal literature that talks about stigmatization and whether or not people will become involved over time because they feel that they're left out if they don't. So there's a new pressure that begins to emerge. So that's already been documented, and of course in psychological literature as well. But I think what's interesting for us is the way that the employee, as a supposed so there's something called the wellness syndrome that Cederstrom and Spicer have written about, very interesting stuff, coming out of City University's business school. And what it refers to is that the healthiest employee is seen as the ideal one. Now, questions around discrimination, again bringing back to legal questions, discrimination, equality of opportunity, and there is very little that's been done so far in terms of what your rights are so far in that context. So the healthiest worker is supposedly the ideal worker, and then the next thing that I'll finish on is to talk about the intimacy that we referred to a little bit. That's also linked to this mythology of work that Fleming's writes about, to do with the self. Obviously, Nicholas Rose, a couple of the papers that were circulated for today. And I think what we are talking about is the next stage of that. And I really think about the facilitation of the technology and how itself. So I think that's what we're kind of interested in, is how that and that's where neoliberalism can be understood. So what do we mean by neoliberalism? There's a whole literature you can read on that, but the way that I refer to it, and in this paper, is more to do with the new abilities to the new invasion of every level of the individual as a worker. And meanwhile, we have this whole question of self-management, because we can actually collaborative work. That's also quite ideal. So actually one more thing in terms of agility. Okay, so the Sheffield Work Psychology Group, and this is linked to some stuff that's been mentioned already today too, is that the projects that were carried out to see to what extent the new agility model is helping productivity, their findings demonstrated actually that it was because people are working together. It's that collaboration. It's because, again, of the relationship with your colleagues. That's what improves productivity, which is fascinating. So the experiments and the studies that are being run right now, that we're asking a lot of bigger questions around: is this going to turn into something that's required? What does this mean? Will you have this control relationship that reminds us of what they were fantasizing in Taylor or in the factory, and mental and manual labor is again sort of separated. But yeah, that's kind of
great, thank you. I would like to pick up on the notion of self-management, which came up in both presentation, and also what you've just said, Phoebe, about this idea of invasion. Because it seems to me that the actualization of self-management, as you said, requires an increase in integration of work and life, and thereby a sense of blurring of boundaries between the sphere of privacy and intimacy and the sphere of labor. So I wonder, in your empirical work and your interviews and surveys with the employees, are they in any sense aware of that invasion, of that blurring of those lines between their personal life and their work life? And if so, how do they handle that? How do you react to it?
I didn't talk about it. I've done some interviews and focus groups with workers. I've not properly analysed them yet, but there was some awareness of that. In the the various people I spoke to, there was a few people who had started out using it and then started to feel quite negative about it for that kind of reason. They were in a minority. Most people, maybe it's kind of a self-selecting group of people who actually volunteered for this, who were quite enthusiastic about it. They were actually quite positive about that blurring, in the sense that they thought it was good, that it was something they could be doing, walking their dog in the morning, but also that it legitimized conducting exercise in work time as well, to an extent. And doing slightly more creative things like having walking meetings and this kind of stuff. But this was only in certain cases when there was sort of management buy-in on it, and when it was very much kind of pushed by management. And I think, to kind of link to something that I think Phoebe was mentioning before, I think that the ideal worker and the healthy person, healthy subject, aligning it. And I think we can see this because of where I think there's an increasing management culture which is built around health, where like probably everyone's managers here is probably running a triathlon or a marathon, or something like this. People talk about marathons, or cycling is the new golf. It's this kind of healthy subject which is kind of being pushed. But in one case, someone was extremely critical of their manager, who had said, this is a really great project. You should be doing this. But and I know everyone's busy, but you should make time for this. And they've said, well, maybe you should give me some more time. It's because they're overstressed and overworked. And so there was a bit of a pushback about it like that, I found. But actually, mostly people were just quite kind of positive about it.
Parrot. Okay. Hello. One of the first things I was said to it is that the main problem was that the project was so badly set up in a way that really, I don't think that they had a major problem with this, in a sense, until Phoebe can say more, because Phoebe was conducting all the interviews. But from just a sort of perspective of setting up experiment, it was almost like giving people a weight scales and asking them, could you please now lose weight, and not providing any sort of any support or any kind of technical. So in this sense, really, it was coming really short. Phoebe, you want to say more about the responses?
Only that the dissemination from the project that we've been funded to do is to design, in fact, an agreeable work design model that can be potentially useful for other companies who are interested in this kind of, and we've learned quite a lot so far. So just that one thing is that employees respond in different ways, and one thing that you've really got to be careful to do is set it up in a way that dialogue is there. The Institute for Quantified Self in Groningen at Hansa University has also been doing a lot of work on looking at coaching. And the final thing that I'll say as well is that, so one of the employees working at the company in Rotterdam herself is an Olympic judo master. And she obviously is going to set a standard, if you like. So in all the interviews, she was the only one who said to me, well, I need to slow down my steps. I need to stop moving around so much, which is fascinating. Most employees were really on side, really excited. Yes, I'd like to be involved with this, but they weren't clear on what the link was to work. So that was one thing. So I think that's something that's being developed right now. So
thank you. Maybe one last point before we pass it to the audience is to do with this meaning-making machine that is this wellness programs, which seems to me quite paradoxical, because at the end of the day, what they are dealing with or producing or using as method is actually numbers and algorithms and data. So how do you see this transition from something that is purely algorithmic and datafied to something that can actually provide meaning and imbue employees with meaning for their work and encourage them to relate to their job in a different, more meaningful way?
So I think there is a certain meaning in numbers, even in the kind of the dataism that Jill mentioned, that data's mean objectivity or transparency or something like that, and people did talk about the employees I spoke to did talk about like that. It objectifies it, and so that seemed to change their relationship to their exercise activities if they weren't used to doing that. So I think there is on that level, but I think it's just working on different levels, and so it's the sort of the existence of the project or the programs generates a certain meaning, that kind of employer brand kind of idea, but also I kind of like to think about these devices as forming a sort of socio-technical assemblage, which helps to manage flows of meaning in a certain way. It makes you kind of encourages you to engage in certain kinds of ways. And I think what's interesting to explore, which I'd like to do further, is what kinds of subjects are kind of assumed in this process. And for me, I think the perceived objectivity is important, but it's also is that connection with others, and it's how it kind of flows from one person or within networks, really. When people are kind of pushing them out there, and around those kind of hashtags that I was looking at, who's actually and in what ways are they controlling the kind of the meaning in that network? Even it might be on a very minute basis. It might just be, I walked loads of steps today, you should do it too. But it's kind of pushing that around a kind of a network, and it doesn't necessarily engage us, as I said, very much on the subjective, discursive level. It's just kind of there. It's just a little nudge. So the power of it is supposedly in that kind of nudge approach is that it's kind of below the level of meaning almost, or kind of conscious meaning. Yeah, affective, exactly. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more with Chris' evaluation, and to add to it, I think we are in such an early stage, especially for this kind of work environments, white collar, or the environment that we're working in, when evaluation of something such as productivity or a work outcome is so much more complex than, for example, in a more kind of algorithmic, factory-based context, where you can, in more, let's say, a bit more easy way, measure the outcomes. So in this sense, we are really just scratching the surface with the tracking technology, because we all have different cognitive style, all have different personality, the beliefs, the way we work, the way we engage with particular tasks. And as I showed there, the meaning of productivity is very different for all of us. So those things have to be somehow operational, standardized, before we have even moved to thinking about the way how we can actually keep track of it, and based on this tracking, make a judgment that will be then embedded into a sort of workflows. And well, when we get to this stage, then the discussion will shift into this kind of more authoritarian and dangerous topics. But I guess that hopefully we'll have some things, some sort of safeguards set up by that time.
Great, thank you very much. So I would like now to open it up to the audience for you to ask questions. So my colleague here will kindly pass the microphone.
Hi, thanks for fascinating talks. So I was wondering a bit more about the role of the people who make the devices, because our university had one of these wellness programs, but they're, I don't know, not very, they wanted us to pay 40 euros for the gadget, and I didn't sign up because, come on. It's interesting though in seeing, it was the administrative staff that actually did get involved. The professors were all like, pfft. And I now know our research admin person has an average of 35,000 steps a day, which is interesting. So you do learn something about other sides of people, right, than you would have otherwise. But in this case, it very much seemed like this is an initiative. This is like the university can now tick something off on their health and safety reports, and it's really coming from outside. Just it's sort of not really integral to the workplace very much. And I wonder if that was your experience too. It would be fascinating to hear from more interviews with people who weren't participants too.
Yeah, okay. So it differed in different workplaces, and a couple of the participant organisations of mine were universities, and also my university did it, and it was very similar. It was mostly the administrative stuff, and that's because I think kind of lecturers, professors aren't really around very much, but also then it was those kind of lower grade staff, the kind of cleaners and porters and cafe workers, which weren't engaged. And as one person quite flippantly said, they walk around all day, so they probably don't need these kind of interventions, which of course, if we look at socio-demographics, they're more likely to be unhealthy in various different ways, but they might walk around a lot. Which is interesting, I think. So I think it was why I framed it in terms of activity is because a lot of the whole emphasis of this has been on tackling sedentarism, right? The kind of people sitting too much, and that is actually only the case for certain kinds of groups of workers. And these programs are, I mean, certainly like the big corporate ones, like the Virgin one, the GCC one I mentioned, they are just bought in and kind of implemented. They say that they come and kind of integrate to your workplace, but they don't really, because it's the same for everyone, really. And I think that is because I think that is about managing. It is about managing that relationship, and they kind of see it in the same way as providing maybe subsidised gym membership or whatever else they do as part of their wellness programs. And as you say, like we have this thing in the UK. You can get an award for being an investor in people, which a lot of these did, and this was part of it. But in other contexts, it was kind of maybe was slightly not necessarily integrated with the work practices, but in one they'd also got lots of awards for environmental initiatives. It was part of their green strategy, because it encouraged people to walk rather than drive to work. And in one case, they'd actually paid for the devices for people out of a grant that they won, like a green grant they won. But they didn't. Interestingly, they didn't tell the staff that. That's how it was funded, and it wasn't presented to the staff at all as an environmental thing. It was just as an individual thing of you can be fitter and healthier. And I thought I found that kind of strange. I thought actually that maybe would engage people, but they didn't seem to think so. So that's how they sold it. That's how they got the money for it, but they actually pushed it to the staff in a different way.
This is a really, really interesting deal. It's made me think. And in the context of our company, so I've tried to break it down into the types of participants, and a lot of the consultants got involved, but then again, I think that really brings in the tensions to do with cognitive work again, because it's one of the shifts of sort of neo-Taylorism is that it's seen as quite difficult, and actually Drucker calls sort of knowledge work something that's not immediately able to be sort of valued and quantified in the same type of way. So once we get to that level, you start to ask new kinds of questions. But despite that, it's again, what is the question that we're asking? So I think the consultants were talking to me and saying, and I'm an outsider, so I could kind of hear what their feelings were about how the project was both set up by the company and also what they thought that the kind of possible results would be. There was some skepticism. There were other questions to do with why are we doing this, and also why don't we have a coach? But going into the kind of questions around having a coach, I wonder whether that kind of brings about questions to do with what the quantified self is. Because the way I understand it, the way that Chris Dancy, the most quantified man in the world, he's got a great quote. And he talks about if that data is knowable, the person who knows it better be you. And he's quite an innovator, and from the beginning of the kind of the movement, has I think been really super kind of, what's the word for it, insightful, because he's saying, okay, this is fine, but you have to recognize that this is about yourself and your own awareness as you have access to this new kind of massive, it's big data, and people forget that. There's a whole politics around accessibility to that level, that data is so rich, and okay, it has existed to some extent. And I mean, that's what Taylor wanted, right? He and Gilbreth both wanted that data. Now we have the possibilities here. I'm not a determinist. I'm not saying, it's because we now have this technology, but it is about our relationship with technology again, and all the post-humanist questions. Does this mean? And then, of course, nobody's asked it yet, but you're probably all thinking it. What about automation? Are the robots going to take our jobs? And if so, does that mean we have to work better with these machines? And is that actually what we're doing by becoming healthier? Blah. Okay. I think that was all I was going to say, really. But I think people are sometimes, and the employees that we worked with, for whatever reason, didn't quite click that this is a personal journey, and that if you are using it at work, which most people only did, so there you go. So is the fact that you're using this, and the questions around, am I working better with my colleagues? We also got that in the first range of interviews. Yes, it is changing relationships with my colleagues. Why is that? We have on the dashboard, so we can see what our colleagues, how many steps they're taking. We can kind of pull together. We can all climb Mount Everest together. These kinds of questions. But what is the bigger question, I guess, is what people kept asking me. But
Great. Any other questions from the audience? We've got Paolo there.
I have a curiosity. Did you experience any case of cheaters or people who have been cheating in your case study?
My father-in-law did. He's very he accidentally put it in the washing machine. That's what it was. And then he said, I've claimed it. But no, that's a phenomenon that is happening, where you give it to your brother, and that's well known now. And of course, it kind of messes up the data. I don't think anybody confessed, quote unquote, to doing it. But yeah, did you have?
Didn't get anyone didn't get anyone confess to doing it, but I asked about that as a phenomenon. Was that a problem? Did it was trust an issue? And the people who were involved in implementing the programs, they said, yeah, I mean, possibly people do. They did sometimes. There were some systems for just checking to see if people were doing ridiculous amounts of steps that seemed out of track. But they said that actually that wasn't really the issue anyway. They didn't really. And that actually it was always about yourself anyway. You're only cheating yourself, and actually it was like with those points, it's about measuring yourself against yourself. So it's pointless, and it doesn't mean anything. There's little prizes, but it's nothing really significant.
But it's an insurance company question as well, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, that's obviously that's in the UK, but in other contexts, where with workplace health insurance, of course, that might be that could be different. I've not. Studied that at all, so I couldn't really say. But it just wasn't really seen as being a big problem. There was a couple of people mentioned, there was some people who seemed to have suspiciously high. They're kind of a bit pissed off, but yeah.
We also had quite a long period from which we captured this data, a year long. So even if there were any cheaters in some points, they couldn't maintain it for the entire period of a year. So I guess that this, in a data sort of perspective, no, we didn't really kind of see it in the data as well.
Okay, perhaps one last quick questions, because I guess our quantified stomach is rumbling at the moment. Yeah.
Thank you. So I'm just curious, picking up on what you just said there about the US context, right, where there's a much more direct financial incentive for the employer to increase employee wellness in order to reduce healthcare expenditure costs, right? So that's a very clear-cut association between employee behavior and employer benefit. But I'm wondering, outside the US context, how explicit in the minds of both the employer and the employee is this relationship or perceived relationship among physical activity, physical movement, the thing that is being measured, as an operationalization of intellectual work, productivity, engagement, all of those sort of cognitive affective terms, and the relationship between sort of the moral good, right? To be a good person is to be healthy, is to be engaged, is to have meaning in work or to do meaningful work. And so that sort of triangle among cognitive affective, moral imperative, and sort of physical activity, the thing that is actually being quantified, how explicitly are those relationships discussed, or are they not?
I think it's a very good question, and I think it's a part of a bigger question about how, in general, are we aware of the context in which the data that's generated can tell stories about us. And we, again, all of us who are sitting here continuously right now are generating digital traces of our behavior, whether it's pushing your laptop key or registering your location in smartphone. Even the simple point, your location with the smartphone already tells a story about you. You are here in Denmark, in this university campus. That profiles your sociodemographically in particular way. And again, we only scratching the surface right now. Right now, for example, I'm looking at publicly available Strava data. So data produced by one of the most popular apps used by cyclists. I'm looking at about million data points, million trips generated around Bristol and Bath area by around about 20,000 people across 3 years. And it's mind-blowing how much information I'm able to get about these particular individuals, both sociodemographically, but even going deeper and testing a simple hypothesis about, for example, classifying them by speed and as trying to infer. I'm using epidemiology approaches to this. I'm using some machine learning. There are techniques that have been used for a long time in those other disciplines that we can now bring here. And the potential is, in a way, scary. And we really don't realize fully the scope of this. I guess that's a kind of a, let's say, bigger question there embedded in your question in a sense.
Yeah, a really interesting point as well. And I think in the context I looked at, it was mostly about the emotional, the kind of the value rather than actually seeing any direct relation. It's more that there was an assumption of a connection between sort of productivity and hardline kind of productivity and healthy people, but I think it was much more of a moralistic discourse. And I mean, sometimes in kind of some reports, so like GCC and Virgin Reports, they produce reports and they like to say that you can see this percentage increase in productivity, and in this kind of thing, and you can calculate the return on investment in this way. And you get kind of government reports that say, a healthier workforce can increase productivity this percentage, this kind of thing. I assume these numbers are largely fabricated, but I don't know how you could kind of quantify it, and certainly not quantifying creative work in that kind of way. But yeah, I think that connection is important, but it's actually really it's a moralistic one.
Okay, well, on that note, I would like to invite you all to lunch downstairs and to thank again our panelists for fantastic presentations.